Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9 o'clock and you're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. I have to say, I'm delighted to be back after a bout of COVID isolation. This morning on The Briefing, we're going to be talking a lot about the COVID restrictions that may well be coming just in time for Christmas and Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister. Stick around for that coming up in 5 minutes after your news with Rosie Wright.
Good morning, I'm Rosie Wright. This is your news at 9 o'clock. Hospitality leaders are urging the Chancellor to offer emergency financial support in the next 24 hours following a fall in bookings because of the Omicron variant. The operator of Real Greek and Franco Manca restaurant chains say rescue packages are needed regardless of whether new measures to reduce the spread of COVID are introduced. The government says support for businesses is kept under constant review. Meanwhile, the chief executive of the Nighttime Industries Association, Michael Kill, told GB News the new restrictions are confusing, with businesses encouraged to stay open, but customers told to stay away.
We're hugely concerned, not only for the survival of businesses, but people's livelihoods. People that we've committed and managed to build up and gain momentum for this trade is now being stifled massively. COVID passes were presented as a mitigation that would keep nightclubs open. That's clearly not the case. And the concern that we have is at some point leading up to New Year's Eve is going to create some level of displacement. And that could go into things like illegal events or push people back into households, which we know full well are, highly transmissible.
Boris Johnson is set to face fresh questions over alleged gatherings held at Downing Street during lockdown after a photograph has emerged of him, his wife and several staff in the No. 10 Garden in May of 2020. The Guardian released this photograph showing the Prime Minister drinking at a table with Carrie Johnson and two others during the first national lockdown. 16 other members of staff can be seen nearby. A Downing Street spokesperson told GB News work meetings often take place in the Downing Street Garden in the summer months. On this occasion, where there were staff meetings following a No. 10 press conference. Retired teachers are being urged to return to the profession to help with COVID staff shortages in the new year. The Education Secretary has appealed for qualified teachers across primary, secondary and further education to return to classrooms. Some schools are already preparing for the possibility of online learning. But Naheem Sahawi says signing up for even 1 day a week would help maintain face-to-face teaching.
Although 99.9% of schools have consistently been open this term, we can all see the tidal wave of Omicron coming our way. Whether you're recently retired or trained as a teacher and have moved profession, I urge you to consider whether you might be able to spare even a day a week to bolster the numbers of supply staff available around the country.
Extra funding to tackle coronavirus across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has been doubled by Westminster. The total sum has been increased to £860 million, with more than half of this going to Scotland. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, says the boost is to ensure people in the devolved nations are supported during the health crisis. First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, tweeted to say half of the allocated money was not new funding, but would go towards helping businesses in the region. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is to take over responsibility for the UK's future relationship with the EU, says Downing Street. It follows the resignation of Brexit Minister Lord Frost, who resigned with immediate effect on Saturday night over what he said was the direction of travel of the government. Ms Truss will also lead negotiations to resolve issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol. In Australia, a sixth child has died following an incident in which a bouncy castle was lifted into the air by a sudden gust of wind. 11-year-old Chase Harrison died in hospital yesterday. 2 other children remain in a critical condition. One is recovering at home following the incident on Tasmania on Thursday. Children at the Hillcrest Primary School in Devonport were celebrating the end of the school year. The Women's Tennis Association say an appearance on Sunday by the Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai did not address its concerns about her well-being. Speaking to the press on camera in public for the first time yesterday, Peng said that she had never accused anyone of sexually assaulting her. She also said that a social media post she shared early last month has been misunderstood. Her well-being became a matter of concern after she accused a government official of sexually assaulting her. That's after social media post was absent from public view for nearly 3 weeks. You are up to date. I'll be back with the headlines for you in half an hour. For now, the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning and happy Christmas. It's just 5 days until the country expects to be coming together with our loved ones, exchanging gifts and eating far too much in a spirit of jollity and togetherness. Or so we hope. Already, big family Christmas ambitions have been scaled back as we were all advised to have smaller gatherings. Still, more are limiting their interactions and cancelling social engagements this week to avoid catching COVID over the next 5 days. Much to the detriment of the hospitality industry, that is. And now the prospect of formal restriction is again rearing its ugly head. Yet for the literally hundreds of thousands who have caught COVID in the last few days, a Christmas lockdown is already their reality. 10 days of quarantine now takes us to the 30th of December. There'll not be much festive celebration in isolation. So sorry to bring a dose of pessimism this Monday morning, but frankly, the data does not look good. Just about anyone in Britain under the age of 35 will know how half their friends have come down with Omicron in the last week alone. This thing is seriously infectious. And the issue with that, the issue with so many of my generation being infected now, as I myself was 2 weeks ago, is that events like Christmas present the perfect opportunity for this super infectious strain of virus to jump from millennials to the vulnerable. The overwhelming majority will be fine, but here's the rub. This virus is so infectious that even if it is significantly milder than Delta, even if a much smaller fraction of those who are infected end up in hospital, if all the vulnerable people in the country are exposed to it on one weekend, and a small fraction of those need medical treatment at the same time, that poses a significant risk to the NHS. This is about timing. Don't get me wrong, everyone will likely catch Omicron at some stage over the next few months. The question is, how can we avoid everyone, especially the vulnerable, getting it at exactly the same time? How can we keep the NHS from being too swamped to treat people not just for COVID, but for other illnesses too? Now, government scientists are reportedly almost uniformly urging formal restrictions on our lives. Yet we hear this morning that the Cabinet is in open revolt against scientists. Some arguments from the Cabinet are very legitimate. The question of how much public consent really exists for onerous restrictions. After almost 2 years of government yo-yoing with our liberties, even the most cautious commentators are now questioning how much longer this can go on. A recent YouGov survey revealed broad opposition to stringent lockdown measures. Additionally, there's the question of proportionality. Restrictions have costs. Whatever is decided should always be the minimum necessary to prevent a genuinely overwhelmed health system. Too often, officials take the maximalist approach. And then there's the question of trust. The government told us we were on a one-way path to freedom over the summer. That's already been picked away at. And the front page of The Guardian newspaper this morning has photographic evidence of those in Number 10 flouting the rules they themselves set. Why would the British public follow restrictions that Number 10 itself took liberties with, even in the first lockdown? It's a serious point. Clearly, advisers applied their own discretion to their own rules last year. So why shouldn't the rest of us do so now? Yet one Cabinet argument that does not hold water is wait and see for more data. We simply do not have time to wait and see. By the time we've waited for fuller data, it would be too late to act. That is the nature of this incredibly infectious virus. It's hard to overstate how much of a difficult time this is to be sat in the hot seat, to be making those decisions. Yet this morning we hear that several options are being weighed up by ministers. The Telegraph is reporting that Boris Johnson is considering 3 broad options. First, advice to families to limit indoor mixing over the Christmas period. Note, this would be not legally binding. Second, restrictions on indoor mixing, social distancing and an 8 p.m. curfew on pubs and restaurants. And third, a full firebreak lockdown. Now, this is an interesting set of options, and I have to say good luck with getting a firebreak lockdown past the Tory party. That option is simply not feasible politically, nor should it be. It would be a kamikaze move for this Prime Minister. Equally, the idea of an 8 p.m. curfew strikes me as bonkers. Have we not learned from last winter? Cramming people into the same space over a shorter period of time is frankly nuts. It creates a corona-friendly exit time rush. Many of these restrictions would be unjustifiable. But we have to recognise there is a sliding scale of difference between advice, restriction and lockdown. Lockdown is clearly unconscionable. But fresh, frank advice, particularly to the most vulnerable, that could be very welcome indeed. For what it's worth, I'm resigned to the fact that this will not be a normal Christmas. I'll not be seeing as many family members this year as was the pre-corona norm. But once we're past the danger point of all the vulnerable people catching this disease at the same time on the same weekend, we can afford to be a lot more normal. The challenge is communicating that fact. And beyond COVID restrictions, one family will be having a less jolly festive season even than those in isolation. That is, of course, the rapidly expanding Johnson clan. Rocked by an own goal-instigated crash in the polls, a 100-strong backbench rebellion, a seismic by-election loss, and now the resignation of the second most popular member of his cabinet, the Prime Minister is in trouble. Probably the most trouble he has been at any point in his premiership. For months now, Tory MPs have been telling the Prime Minister to get a grip. Yet now this seems a much more urgent demand. It's clear this government needs to change to survive, not just on competence, but as Lord Frost demonstrated, also on ideology, conviction and political direction. Boris will continue to lose friends if he continues to U-turn, raise taxes and avoid radical regulatory reform. In short, how much longer does this Prime Minister have if he continues to squander his historic majority? Well, to go over those big questions facing the Prime Minister and indeed the Conservative Party this week, let's talk to Henry Hill, the news editor of Conservative Home, who joins us now. Welcome to the programme, Henry. Is Boris Johnson in as much trouble as everyone seems to think he is?
Yeah, it certainly looks like it. I mean, people like me have made fools of themselves before by trying to put a fixed date on when Boris Johnson's luck might run out, so I've got very hesitant about doing it. But there certainly do seem to be more and more factors stacking up in his disfavour. He's lucky in a way that he's got a bit of a break over Christmas with MPs going away. But the crucial thing for Boris, the thing that's got him through every previous scandal, is the fact that he looked like a winner. And as long as he was ahead in the polls, and as long as the party was ahead in the polls, Conservative MPs were prepared to put up with pretty much everything that previously went wrong for the Prime Minister and his government. But now that they're underwater, now that Labour are yapping at their heels and the Liberal Democrats have returned to their traditional role in British politics of winning spectacular by-election victories, now Tory MPs are going to start being much more worried about their seats, and that puts Johnson in a very dangerous position indeed.
Now, it's unrealistic to assume that a government will always be ahead in the polls, particularly mid-term. We are, of course, 2 years in to this government. It's just over 2 years since that December general election of 2019. What on earth can Boris Johnson do in order to win back the respect of his members of Parliament that would still allow him to be behind in the polls, as most governments will be mid-term? How can Boris be both respected, have authority, and be behind in the polls?
Well, it's very tricky for him. I think the big problem for Johnson is the fact that, if you compare him to another Tory prime minister such as Margaret Thatcher, when she was behind in the polls, it was because her government was committed to doing something that it thought was unpopular, was important, but that was unpopular. And so therefore, even if, Tory MPs, and there were lots of Tory MPs back then who were frightened about what the polls were saying and didn't particularly like Mrs. Thatcher, they understood why it was happening. They understood, some of them, that it was necessary. What's so dangerous about the Prime Minister's unpopularity, yes, you're right, most governments, do go behind in the polls in midterms. We have got used to a very strange situation over the last few years where the Tories have been perpetually ahead. But it's that we're behind in the polls for no good reason. As you say, these are all own goals. He didn't have to go out and try and save Owen Paterson. He didn't have to try and overrule the Standards Commissioner. He didn't have to apparently have lockdown busting parties. These aren't good things to be behind for, and they speak to a problem that, what is the Prime Minister for? Johnsonism, there's no meat on the bones of it. If you look at the 2019 Tory manifesto, the entire message was get Brexit done, which he mostly has. But there's now nothing that these MPs have committed themselves to. When we talk about, planning reform and all the rest of it, none of it was really spelled out in the manifesto. They're not committed to it. The Prime Minister isn't committed to it. And it's going to be very hard for him to dig out a transformational agenda now and get MPs to commit to it.
This is a really interesting point because, of course, at the time, people were saying what a genius manifesto, so light on detail, very hard to criticise, the exact opposite of the 2017 manifesto, which, of course, spelled out basically an entire political term and did so and put all the deeply unpopular things in that manifesto. It became an almost suicide note. Are you saying that there's the exact opposite problem with this 2019 manifesto? Almost too thin, not enough detail, and now the government is a little bit lost because of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think often the things that look like your strengths when you're on the up do look like your weaknesses when you're on the down. And Boris Johnson, previously, we were all able to say, look, isn't it extraordinary? He's thrown off Tory doctrine. He's been able to reach out to new voters who haven't voted for the party in a very long time, if ever. And that was all true. But the problem does mean that now when he's in trouble and you're asking Tory MPs to be loyal, the question to ask is, what are they being loyal to? There's no programme. There's only the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister seems to be personally the source of most of the problems. Now, 2017 is an object lesson in how not to do a manifesto. There is too much in it, too many things to attack, and any government can only do so many major reforms in a given parliament. But the problem is that Boris went entirely on Brexit, got that done relatively early, and now has nothing to do. If he'd included one or two other major areas that he'd gone into in some detail, he'd have a manifesto commitment to that, which would mean that he'd have an easier time getting it through the Lords. Tory MPs would know where they stood and what they were fighting for. He went too far the other way. He focused exclusively on Brexit, and now his government is adrift.
Now, your website, Conservative Home, runs a regular survey of Conservative Party members in terms of who they believe are the most popular members of the cabinet, and consistently high has scored Lord Frost, David Frost, the Brexit minister, or at least the Brexit minister until this weekend. Now, Lord Frost was the second most popular member of the cabinet in your survey in its most recent incarnation, and now he's out of the cabinet. He resigned over the political direction of this government. I suppose my question is both, to what extent does this rock Boris Johnson, but more so, do other people agree with him? Is there going to be a revolt on the right? Is there now significant pressure for Boris Johnson to spell out how he will cut taxes, how he will reduce regulation, how he will deliver the free market reform that so many backbench Tories want to see?
I think those two questions are actually connected. Lord Frost was one of the few members of the government who was part of Boris Johnson's original Vote Leave team. He was also, not coincidentally, running one of the few areas of the government where the government seemed to have a proper sense of strategic grip and focus. If you look at how they conducted the Northern Irish negotiations over the last year or so, there's been a real sense that that bit of the government knew what it wanted, which is so often lacking from other areas. And his presence in government was reassuring to a large number of Conservative MPs, on the right of the party, pro-Brexit, who might, on other areas such as lockdown, COVID restrictions, been worried about the Prime Minister's ideological drift. And so his departure is a personal blow to the Prime Minister. They were quite close, but it is also a signal to a lot of MPs that actually, yes, Boris Johnson really is this ideologically unsound from their perspective. What he does about that, I don't know. It is going to be difficult for him because at the moment he's torn between conflicting sources of advice and dangerously, in the long term potentially, but now he has the ability to deliver COVID regulations with Labour support, which in the short term means that he can endure very large rebellions of Conservative MPs. But that means that he's gradually destroying his authority with the Conservative backbenchers. And when the moment comes when Labour do decide to oppose him, his position could become impossible.
Finally, very quickly, we don't have much time at all, but we're assuming that Rishi Sunak is a contender to replace Boris Johnson. We're assuming Liz Truss as well is. Do you have any other names for us?
It's always a fool's game. I think the problem those two will have is that they're largely pitching for the same wing of the Tory party, which is the liberal, which is a sort of economic right liberal wing. So I imagine you might have Tom Tugendhat standing as a sort of a classic wet, if you like, and maybe Priti Patel for the authoritarians, or an authoritarian candidate will run as well. But I couldn't put my name to putting any names on them.
Well, on that note, Henry Hill, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. A really fascinating discussion, really torrid political times that we have found ourselves in. Well, after announcing tougher restrictions are to be enforced in Wales after Boxing Day, the Welsh Government will decide the fate of festive sporting events later today. Our Wales reporter Lily Hewitson is across the story for us. Welcome to the programme, Lily. Do you have any idea what the Welsh Cabinet will decide today and if the Games will go ahead over Christmas?
Yes, good morning, Tom. Several Welsh sporting events have already been postponed because of cases of COVID-19 within squads. But today a decision will be made, not necessarily if, but perhaps how sporting events can go on here in Wales, over the festive period and into the new year later on today. Now, both Cardiff City and Swansea City games were cancelled over the weekend because of positive cases within both teams. And in rugby, the Ospreys forfeited their Champions Cup match because of positive cases within their camp as well. Now, the First Minister has said he's waiting for a little bit more information as to how the Omicron variant works in outdoor areas before the Welsh Government make any kind of decision on sporting events later on today. But he will be speaking to the organisers of the Welsh Grand National as well as the rugby and football matches that will be going ahead over the Christmas period before making this decision later on. Now, Cardiff are due to host Coventry City here at the Cardiff City Stadium on Boxing Day, but we will have to wait until later on today to find out if that match will be going ahead as well as others.
Now, the Treasury has announced it's going to be giving the Welsh Government an additional £270 million to fight the surge of Omicron. But what exactly is this money going to be spent on?
Yeah, that's right, Tom. An awful lot of money, extra funding is going to be coming over to Wales, particularly after the First Minister said on Friday at his press conference that Wales's ability to tackle Omicron was severely constrained by the Treasury's refusal to help the devolved nations with these extra restrictions that could come in if England weren't doing the same. So, for example, it's things like furlough. The Welsh Government can't decide things like furlough without that additional funding from the UK Government. So the First Minister is saying that it's slightly unfair and that he can't make those decisions without that money coming in first. So it's been confirmed by the Chancellor Rishi Sunak today that the Welsh Government will receive that additional £270 million on top of its autumn budget already. This is due to a meeting that took place over the weekend with the leaders of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland with Stephen Barclay, where this decision was made. The Scottish Government will be getting an additional £440 million to tackle Omicron, as well as Northern Ireland getting an additional £150 million. Now, when announcing these new restrictions, which are coming into place in Wales on the 27th of December, the First Minister said that it's not fair that ministers in England, when making these decisions, know that the money is going to be there to back them in their decision making, whereas in Wales, we have to wait for that money to be made available. But there's now questions where people are wondering, perhaps could we be getting tougher tougher or more restrictions here in Wales in the run-up to Christmas or perhaps after Christmas now that this money is being made available?
Yes, a worrying time, I suppose, not just for people facing those restrictions, but also for the taxpayer who has to fork out all the cash for it. Well, Lily, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning and that interesting news from those devolved governments. Really, really concerning. Well, a month ago, the government announced its new rail plan for the North and the Midlands. The integrated rail plan showed that plans to run HS2 trains up to Leeds would now mostly rely on existing lines, and the old HS2 Eastern leg will be scrapped. But despite the publication of the lengthy integrated rail review, ambiguity remains. The government has said all options remain on the table, leaving many of those living along old routes quite confused. Well, our Yorkshire and Humber reporter, Kevin Larkin, is in Bramley, near Rotherham, for us to explain all of this. Welcome to the programme, Kevin. So, this new route, has it actually been scrapped, as we were told last month, or has it not been?
Well, Tom, it's a very good question. Where I am now, the HS2 trains would be coming through this field you can see behind me. And at the moment, I can't give you a straight answer on that. When the integrated rail plan was revealed last month, we were told that the HS2 Eastern leg, which would have come through here, was scrapped. That led to fury from northern mayors and business leaders who accused the government of betraying the North. But there was celebration from communities like this, thinking they were now out of this nightmare that many of them have been living in for several years. But interestingly, in the small print, the government did say they were going to have a review of how HS2 trains would get into Leeds. Now, most of that route would be going up existing rail lines for Midland Main Line, but they left that door open, and having asked a few more questions about this, the government is saying the reasons they can't lift the safeguarding from this area and remove these homes from being under blight is because they still need the answers on how they're going to get these HS2 trains up to Leeds. So common sense would kind of dictate, wouldn't it, that if they're keeping the safeguarding here while they carry out this review, then therefore this area may end up playing a part in that. So it seems like this route is still an option, at least in theory, at the moment.
So what happens to all those homes and businesses along the route which have been bought, which have been compulsory purchased, as they were due to be demolished for the line? Will they now be demolished?
Well, yeah, so HS2 has bought 450 properties since 2014 along the old HS2 Eastern route between Birmingham and Leeds. And Tom, that is worth a whopping £115 million. Now, what the government has said is that when they make this final decision on this review of how they're going to get the HS2 trains into Leeds, and they can give a definitive answer one way or another, if it's still the case that they don't need the homes here, they'll be sold subject to what they call the Critchell Down rules, where the former owners essentially get first dibs on whether they want to buy their properties back at market value. But having covered this story for 5 years in this area, many of those homeowners who I've spoken to over the years who sold up and have now moved away were very clear that they wouldn't be going back at all, because no matter where they are now and the hassle of moving anyway, they'll always have this niggle that someone has drawn a line on a map saying this area could be there. So even if the blight is lifted and the government says it's not going to happen, many people here will still have that lingering doubt and not want to put themselves in that position.
It seems like there is a huge amount of uncertainty for local people in the area. Has HS2 had anything to say explicitly to them on this whole situation?
Well, HS2 has refused to comment on this story, saying this is a matter for the Department for Transport. A Department for Transport spokesperson has told us, we recognise the impact that HS2 has had on residents on the proposed line, and that's why our compensation schemes go far beyond what the law requires. And it continues, the government has now committed to explore the most effective way to run HS2 trains to Leeds, and it's important we safeguard properties until final decisions are taken. A failure to do so would cost the taxpayer more and cause greater uncertainty for residents.
Well, it's not an ideal situation. It doesn't sound like it's all resolved yet, but I know that you'll keep plugging away at it. Thank you very much, Kevin, for bringing us that update on an interesting story on HS2 there for us this morning on The Briefing. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this Monday morning on The Briefing. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Moroki. But first, here's the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking cloudy for many once again, though there are some breaks possible in the east. Let's look at the details. Largely cloudy skies across southwest England this morning, with fewer breaks in the cloud expected today than yesterday. A breezy morning along the English Channel coasts, highs of around 9 Celsius. Across southeast England, rather cloudy though, a chance of some bright spells later this morning. Light winds with a high of around 8. A widely cloudy day across Wales with limited brightness, the chance of a bright spell across the west of the high ground later on. Across the Midlands, after a generally cloudy start this morning, there's chance of some bright or sunny spells, particularly in the east later on, staying dry with light winds. Crossing to the Pennines in the northeast England, there is a greater chance of seeing some bright or sunny spells today, though there will be plenty of cloud around this particular morning. Patchy rain and drizzle will push southwestwards across southern Scotland at first. It will then be a mostly dry but rather cloudy morning with just a few isolated bright spells. Heading to Northern Ireland now, and the cloudy theme continues. It's a chance of some bright sunny spells developing later on this morning, highs of around 7 Celsius. Now remaining cloudy with some bright spells in the east this afternoon, though a chance of some patchy drizzle, and that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday